Every week, HR is expected to make expensive decisions with half the information and all the accountability, from benefits to workforce strategy. No pressure or anything. That's where Aon can step in and help. They help orgs across 120 countries cut through the noise with insights on health, retirement plans, total rewards, and AI, sharing data that gives leaders clarity instead of anxiety spirals. Aon exists to shape decisions for the better, so organizations can protect their people, grow their business, and stop pretending we'll figure it out later is a reliable strategy. Better data, better outcomes, that's Aon. This is Better Decisions, a special podcast series with Aon in partnership with I Hate It Here. I'm Hiba Youssef, your host and favorite HR person. A quick reality check before we get to today's episode. Women make up nearly half the workforce, and their health and benefits are sometimes still treated as a nice to have, a line item, and potentially an afterthought. And that mindset is pretty expensive. We're talking in terms of retention, financial security, career stability. All of it's connected, and most organizations are still making decisions in this space based on vibes and legacy assumptions. This episode, I'm joined by Kevin Fyock and Kembre to unpack why women's health keeps getting deprioritized, what it actually costs to wait for a crisis, and what it looks like when we finally get this right. And we'll wrap with the question I end every episode in this series with: what's one decision organizations keep getting wrong, and what would a better one actually look like? Let's get into it. Kevin and Kembre, welcome. Why don't you all introduce yourselves so folks know who exactly they are listening to?
Hi, thank you so much for having us today. Kembre Roberts. I work for Aon, which is a consulting firm and really supporting health transformation, which is for our folks on the call. It's where we spend our time with clinical strategy and 5 dimensions of well-being to really make a difference for employee population. So I've been in this field for 25 years and love to really focus on how do we really leverage the workforce to make a difference in the lives of each and every one of us. So, Kevin?
Thanks, Kembre, and hi, everyone. Hiba, thanks so much for the opportunity. My name's Kevin Fyock. I lead innovation for Aon's Health Solutions business. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about sort of what research that we want to do to arm our clients with what problems they want to solve. Spend a lot of time in this space that we'll talk about today, but then also, as you can imagine, artificial intelligence, the emerging language model space, and all things tech and tech adjacent as we think about sort of next year and 5 years into the future, where is HR going to be and where's healthcare going to be? So excited for today's chat.
I can't wait. I've been waiting for this episode for weeks. When we first scoped it out, I was like, yes, I can't wait to get to this topic. It's something I talk a lot about: women's health, financial well-being, all of that. It's all intertwined and it's so connected. And it does feel like sometimes when you're experiencing work today that it is an afterthought. So I'm excited to dig in this topic with both of you. I want to start with a really big question. Why should employers care about women's health? I know, loaded. I went big.
I love this question. One, because it's such a broad topic, and who wouldn't want to talk about women more than women, on this platform today. But I think what we have to really think about is that women's health is a workforce performance issue. And I think we've been very siloed into thinking that women's health is something that we talk about from the health plan, but it really makes a difference in decisions that happen to us as women across the spectrum of health throughout our career. And so we've got to be really careful that women's health isn't a benefit program. There's some aspects like that Kevin and I'll share, today that I think are important in women's health that employers need to think about. But even more so, women's health impacts your career. It impacts how you show up at work. It impacts how you think about your ability to be promoted and deliver. And that spectrum's pretty wild. So whether we're starting our careers and we may or may not be thinking about family forming, we may be thinking about family forming as taking care of pets and not live children. But then when we get into our 40s and 50s, we're definitely thinking about where menopause impacts some of the decisions that we make on how we carry ourselves in the workforce. And so incorporating this into productivity and career is, I think, where we've got to take women's health as an employer and how broad that is today.
Yeah, I All of that was resonating with me as I was thinking through why people should care about this. I'm like, it's so intertwined. It's a part of every single thing we do without us even realizing that that's what the case is. So I love that you outlined all the areas that it has impact for someone at work. Kevin, anything you want to add about why employers should care?
No, I agree with everything Kembre said. And I think Kembre, I'm fortunate to work with her and sort of all of her knowledge in this space. I think what we'll talk about, throughout today is just this focus on productivity. So I'm really glad Kembre mentioned that, because I think when we think about the opportunity to impact productivity, there's a huge financial dollar associated with it as well. There's a stat I recently read that, by 2040, if you actually close the women's health gap, can save like $400 billion throughout, improved workforce participation. So huge linkage to productivity, huge linkage to savings. And I think that'll be part of the theme that we talk about today is when you get this right, it impacts business performance, it impacts EPS, it impacts all these tactics or metrics rather that I think employers really care about.
That honestly tees me up perfectly for my next question, because I have to ask about why decisions around women's health are often treated as this nice to have instead of a strategic thing, and that can actually drive a business forward. And what do you think the cost of that mindset is to organizations today?
Yeah, I love this question because it is viewed as a nice to have. And I think part of the reason, Hiba, is it's narrowly equated to fertility and maternity. And we've made so much progress, especially in the employer space in the past, dozen years, where, more women have access to family forming benefits like IVF. But that only constitutes a minority of sort of the women's health journey, right? And so it's easier to classify women's health as optional when you think about it just being fertility or maternity, and framing it like that sort of, ignores outside family formation. So that's point one. And then the second one is, I think a lot of leaders really start to underestimate the duration and complexity that's associated with women's health journeys. And Kembre, I know we'll talk about sort of some of the clinical impacts, but when we think about conditions like menopause and autoimmune disorders, chronic pain, they're not short-term events. They span many, many years, and they oftentimes are aligned with peak career stages. And there's some really interesting stats, that you can point to, especially around the diagnostic delay that occurs with certain conditions like endometriosis. It can be 6 to 8 years, almost 10 years. And that leads to prolonged productivity loss. And when you think about, the second part of your question around the cost issue, with this complexity comes cost. And it's rarely captured in one budget line item. Like when we work with our clients, it's not like this is a women's health line item and this is, line item ABC. Sometimes I wish it would be, because it'd be easier to sort of drive this forward, but instead sort of appears as prolonged diagnostic journeys, disengagement, and then delayed advancement. And then what you have is a situation where you have leadership drop off and you have avoidable turnover. And we don't want that, but we're losing women from the workforce because of this complexity and sort of the resulting cost impact.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because I just saw this tweet last week as they were announcing org changes at OpenAI, where they were moving around some people and some people were stepping down. And somebody retweeted the article because someone is stepping down because they were recently diagnosed with breast cancer. And I have so much empathy for that woman navigating that challenge and then have to publicly tell everybody I can't do this executive role anymore because I have to focus on my health. I thought it was so interesting because somebody retweeted it and said, why does it feel like every woman who reaches the highest stages is suddenly dealing with massive health implications and is having to step back from their work? And everything you were saying about how long it takes to get diagnosed with endometriosis. I have an autoimmune condition, which I talk about. It's a very common one that it's related to my thyroid. But there are days where I'm unable to move. And if I have to explain that to my executive team every single time that I'm experiencing a flare up, it's not great. But I thankfully have a very open executive team where I share these types of things. But the cost of ignoring it or not paying enough attention or only really addressing women's health issues when it becomes an issue, I think is really draining organizations of some of their top talent as well.
Sure. And I think what you're touching on, Hib, is interesting, because this mindset drives like this fragmentation when it comes to the solutioning this space. There's been a lot of great innovation in the women's health space, like around point solutions and focusing on specific conditions, fertility at large, like I mentioned before. But when you have these onesie, twosie solutions, it takes away from having a more cohesive strategy. And it makes it really hard for employees to navigate their journey. It makes it harder for employers to really see a meaningful return on investment, because you're like, plugging holes, everywhere, as opposed to saying, this is this longitudinal thing that I want to solve.
Yeah. One thing that I might add that we're dancing around and not necessarily diving in whole is that we're, addressing women's health and diagnostic conditions that we're all very familiar with. But I think making that connection to financial well-being for a female, also caregiving responsibilities. And I think even the comment that you've just made around why are women stepping down? I think, Aon has definitely looked at this data. I think we're supported by many of our peers in the marketplace to acknowledge how many females compared to males are actually, maintaining caregiver responsibilities, why they're taking care of their health. And they're also most likely to be the benefits decision makers of their household on how individuals are approaching healthcare and maintaining that. So there's just a lot of additional considerations when we think about how do we leverage women's health in the workplace, but how do we make sure that women are supported in order to maintain their care and deliver work-life balance at the same time. So I think we're asking a lot along the way. And I think that's where there's so many things that employers are trying to solve for, where the nice to have has been, how do we deliver that through benefits programming as opposed to consistently being able to step back. And I think we did this really well during COVID. We thought about these things. We were really intentional.
Oh, yeah.
And as we continue to look at our employee sentiment survey that Aon, publishes annually, we're really seeing that the trend of well-being from an employee's perspective is that in 2020, you did a great job. As we look and continue from 2020 now going into the end of 25, employers were saying, we're doing a great job. We're providing all these things. And employees still in 25 are saying, not quite. There's still some things that are missing, and we still feel like we're struggling in this space. And that's on both genders. So even more so for women that are taking on caregiving and financial well-being responsibilities in their household. So we have opportunity here, and glad we can talk through this today.
For sure. I'm honestly like, this is a topic I'm deeply passionate about, one, because I do identify as a woman. So like, I already feel this, but I'm also looking at this data a lot. And I also read a study that was saying that even in like 50-50 split relationships, where it's like man, woman, and they split the duties equally, women still take on more of this like caregiving duty, and they have to take steps back from their career, or things have to drop because they're taking on this more responsibility, even when they say it's a 50-50 split. So I think there's an incredible book about this called Invisible Women, where she digs into data all throughout a bunch of different categories and talks about how women aren't represented in all sorts of data, and what does that mean, and how do we interpret these things. So highly recommend for anyone listening to read the book. As you were talking about the financial implications to women's health, I was really thinking about asking around, how does women's health directly influence financial security and career sustainability? And what role do we as employers play in that relationship?
So maybe I can start here, and then Kembre, we can sort of ham and egg it a little bit. But, I mentioned before this idea of like the fragmentation that exists and the attempt to solve, problems, in maybe a less strategic way. But when you have a women's healthcare journey that's fragmented and oftentimes poorly designed, women are put in a situation where they have to absorb costs in a handful of different areas. So they have to absorb it through unpaid time, through out-of-pocket care, and then also through like having to be their own advocate and having to coordinate themselves across, their provider landscape. And it really turns into, in many ways, like invisible labor. And that invisible labor reduces earning power and it reduces savings. And we can probably have a whole discussion based on sort of the earning potential for women relative to men and the issue that poses. But when we think about, and then I'll turn it over to Kembre, but when we think about how organizations oftentimes really praise and focus on resilience, careers are sustained by like structural stability during very predictable life transitions. And when you have these healthcare challenges and when women are having to absorb this invisible, labor that I just spoke about, it really collides with these rigid roles. And women are forced into short-term compromises that really undermine long-term career viability. And, Heba, you said that you're passionate about this. I am too. I'm the son of a mother. I have a wife. I have a daughter. And when I think about watching the women in my life and how they've interacted with their careers or school or what have you, small changes that happen can have foundational impacts to someone's career down the road. So that's why I'm so glad we're talking about this today, because it's not just, as I mentioned before, folks in family forming age. It's like across the continuum, impacting women at every, stage of their career and their life, candidly.
Yeah. I mean, this is, again, one of my favorite topics to talk about. Could rant about this forever, but I'm glad I have two experts here to talk me through all the interesting data. Because I think when you're having these conversations as an employer, as like we as HR, why should we care about these things? There's also that conversation of what is the return on the investment that everyone really wants to talk about. And I can't just walk into my executive team and say, I'm really passionate about this because I'm a woman and here are why we should care about it. I do also have to present a strong case of facts as to why these things are important. And there's no questions asked at this topic and how women experience work and frankly are leaving the workforce in waves this last year is such an important conversation that we should be having as we're talking about the next wave of talent at our organizations. How do we improve our benefits to be more inclusive? All of that stuff. But Kembre, I'll pass to you and hear what you have to think.
Yeah, I mean, I think just considering this experience as someone that had 3 children and so went through 3 family building occurrences with, access to great benefits and, maternity leave and those support mechanisms early in my career, I think it's wonderful to see the investment that we've made on paternity leave, where we not only have employer enforcement, but we also have state and federal, emphasis on really thinking about that paternity experience a little bit more, which is a lot better than where I was returning back from work and a 6-week maternity leave, right? Just covered around the health conditions of returning back to work. And so I think we've made great progress in the industry. But I also reflect upon early in my career, having a really strong leadership team and really being supportive of career growth for all. So regardless of the time off that I was taking to build a family and taking care of that aspect of health, there was also a lot of great career support. And I think that's mixed in the market today. I think some individuals, take the steps to take care of their health. And there's a consequence of maybe their performance isn't measured that year or it's not reflected on being eligible for moving up in the career track. And so I think we have to be really intentional around driving talent and really focused on performance and allowing time for some of these experiences to be blended into the work career track as opposed to being a setback. And I think that's why we're seeing the choice to either become a stay-at-home mom permanently or making some other decisions of moving to another employer that may be more flexible with that career track flexibility. So ultimately, we're losing really great talent in some of our markets by not considering some of those aspects. And when I think about the financial security piece, I think as pay equity has continued to be a topic of discussion, not just here in the US, but globally, I think some of that is coming to fruition around how do we balance that? How do we focus on talent? And there's more, guidelines about how to create that balance. But I do think for women to know in the workforce that I don't have to take a step back to take care of myself. It's okay to stop and, manage through some of the things that are different about an aging population of women or an early career, woman coming into the workforce and what's most important to them, whether it's mental health, whether it's physical health, that we're here to support them and able to help move them forward and balance both at the same time for a successful career.
If making people decisions lately feels like a guessing game with expensive consequences, welcome to everyone's nightmare. Aon helps organizations make better decisions about people, risk, and everything in between using actual data, not vibes, not gut feelings, real data. They call it the business of better decisions for a reason. It's time HR had better tools to work with. You're giving me so much, both of you, to think about as I always just get like deeply heated about this topic as well. Cause I'm like, the systems are not set up to support all of us. And it's interesting because I think it was 2 years ago, I wrote a send about Are Working Mothers Okay? And in the send, I specifically said, I do not have children, but I have friends that are mothers. My mother is a mother. Like, I have people that I care about very deeply in my life that are mothers. And I'm writing this to help us understand, are we building systems that actually support women at all stages in their life? And the resounding feedback I got was a lot of people thanking me for like talking about the issue. And I was like, I don't want to be thanked. I want us to all work together to figure out how do we do something about this. So I love the data that you all are giving us, because I think that can really arm HR people in the room when they're trying to have these conversations to build these better systems, to build these support that people desperately need. But it also makes me think about that there is some data that there's just like, we don't have enough information around, like an invisible decision gap kind of exists today because we don't have all our women's health data, or it's underrepresented or misunderstood. So how would the two of you think about what data is really important to arm HR teams with as they're trying to talk about this topic of women's health and well-being and financial wellness with a set of nuance that helps their executives understand, okay, this is an important thing we should care about?
No, this is a really great question because, one, I think, we work in an industry that cares a lot about data and ensuring that employers have access to data. And I think there's some simple steps that can be taken, right, around getting access to what your carrier has available to you, what sort of programs you have in place today, and what's actually happening in your population. So just setting the foundation for, do I have the right population health information to guide decisions I'm making as an employer? And I think we do a really good job of setting that cadence in the work that we do every day. I think to elevate that, though, we have to really combine performance data. So as you think about the aspect of a benefits leader or total rewards leader, they're very focused on benefits, compensation considerations, but we really have to lean in to what are the performance metrics that are happening with those individuals, and are there things that we're missing along the way that are not being considerate of? Is not just a stressful environment at work, but could potentially this individual maybe need mental health support, or maybe they're actually going through a diagnostic journey where they do have cancer and they don't want to share it with others, and it's very private, but they're trying to do their best job at work, and have we supported them differently? So collecting all of that together, I think is super important. And then I think it's also, important to be able to acknowledge to our executive leadership team, there are many things unspoken that are happening in the workplace today where individuals are trying to mitigate the risk of their health being an issue in order to get their work done, right? So they're just going through being able to hold down the fort, if you will, in their workplace, but you don't know that right now they're experiencing menopause hot flashes and they need the air conditioner on, and they're still trying to perform on a call right now, just as we're on, right? And so those things are not known. And so we need to bring them to light for our executive leadership team, especially in situations where maybe our board or maybe even most of our senior leaders are all male. And so unless they have a spouse or a parent that has been very open about sharing some of their struggles, they may not actually know the volume that's happening in their population on some of these unique needs. But Kevin, I'd love for you to add other things that we're definitely taking to executive leaders to really make the case for women's health.
Yeah, I agree with everything Kembre said. And I think, Kevin, back to your question specifically around data, there's like the data that we arm our clients with that they can bring to their leadership around, again, the struggles that there's oftentimes not a women's health line item from a budget perspective.
Yeah.
But I'd even go back 2 and 3 steps before that, which is like structurally, from a foundational perspective, the way women are viewed in even clinical trials and studies. I was looking the other day for fun at cardiovascular studies.
For
And
fun.
the percentage of, for fun, the percentage of those studies that have underrepresented, proportionally, female. And like 65% of those studies, I think, didn't have enough women relative to men in the study. And that's for cardiovascular conditions, arguably, something that is talked about from a holistic health perspective the most. And you have a situation where for such a long time, women have been so underrepresented. So there's the data that we help our clients with that they bring to their leadership. But then there's, as an industry, we're hamstrung by, women being oftentimes underrepresented. And it's not just cardiovascular health, it's broader than that as well. But I think there's just so much focus on cardiovascular health because it does impact women much differently than it impacts men, the way it presents, through an MI or other types of cardiac events.
I love that you bring that up because maybe I told you this. My dad and my brother both passed away from heart attacks. So cardiac health is like very important in my family, but women experience heart attacks very differently from how men experience heart attacks. And oftentimes people think that the number one killer of women is breast cancer. It's actually cardiac events.
That's right.
And I think I'm deeply passionate about getting people to understand there's a gap because how they studied heart attacks initially was just in men. And if you look at the medical records, it's like a 6 foot, 200-pound man. And I'm like, okay, but I'm not a 6 foot, 200-pound man. So maybe it looks different for me. And I'm very cognizant of the signs because this is now part of my family history. So I know it manifests more as heartburn or anxiety for women than it does in that dramatic, clutching your left arm and keeling over the way men experience cardiac events.
Right. Yeah, it's so true, Hiba. And I think that's where I want to take us back more structurally, just about the foundation that women have to operate it in oftentimes work against them. And if you and I were to go into the ER talking about, classic bigender, cardiac symptoms, they would present differently. And I think, unfortunately, the way women are listened to in a medical community is different than the way men are. And that needs to change too. So I realize we're sort of deviating away from the employer space, but I think it's really important because that's part of sort of the challenges that our clients have when they're trying to wrangle how they can best impact their members.
Yeah. And I mean, it's also hard when you're trying to get that data and you're trying to make your case and get the point across, if you don't have the right data too, I think for HR people, then that makes it even harder to go in there and something you deeply know or care about. The challenge gets even harder when you can't find that data or it's underrepresented or they haven't studied in women. And I do think menopause, Kembre, to your part, there's a lot of people that are now talking about menopause in the workplace. And it feels like we were not having this type of conversation 5 years, 10 years ago. And now I have more friends that are talking about perimenopause, trying to help everyone understand what does it look like when you're experiencing this. And it just feels like so many people are unaware of the symptoms. And now women are talking about it more and more companies are thinking to themselves, okay, we really should have some sort of solution or offering or support around women that are experiencing this transition in their life. I often gripe about employer benefits that sometimes they only seem to focus on the women's fertile years. And I'm like, why do I only seem to matter if I'm if I'm bringing children into this world? I should matter at all points in my life. And so this added focus of thinking about how we can support women as they're navigating menopause in their life is really interesting to me too. And there's a lot of cool data around it. I have a question about being proactive in the space. How can organizations make proactive decisions in this space of women's health and financial wellness without waiting for things like a crisis, which feels like what we're currently experiencing as many women left the workforce this year, attrition, or even public pressure? Because I do feel like a lot of people are starting to add public pressure on their companies to have better benefits offerings.
100%. And I think a little bit, as I talked about before, I think organizations have to shift from being reactive to more focused on anticipatory, workforce planning. Have use the example the family forming years. I don't think an employer should look at their demographics and be like, okay, well, our average age is X, so this is the program we need. We need a fertility program, or we need just a menopause. But no, you need all programs because people are different ages. And when you build sort of strategies that account for predictable, life stage needs without making assumptions, and I think that's really key about not making assumptions about individual choices, that's, I think, the way you can actually empower women, and you can provide them with this suite of benefits that are going to speak to them, because we can't make assumptions of whether or not someone wants to start a family or how they're going to deal with, how they age and the clinical presentations of aging. And so when you think about sort of like designing support across, this flexible like life stage planning, thinking about early career, thinking about caregiving years, thinking about later career transitions. So rather than, deploying these one-off solutions, because at the end of the day, like we have a labor market that is defined by employer loyalty, but women's health has become like one of the most powerful attraction and retention levers. And we could, again, go off just talking about caregiving, but the percentage of women who voluntarily left the workforce, and Kembre talked about this, in 2025 was like almost 50%. I think it was 45%, something like that. But going back to the economic impact that I touched on before, caregiving at large in the United States accounts for like $1 trillion, of total cost annually. And we know that women provide a lion's share of caregiving in the United States, like 2/3 of it. So again, you can do the math to say, like, if you focus on this and you get it right, there's an impact to an organization. And, organizations that are more proactive in how they design these strategies can measure their success through productivity, through engagement, through retention, leadership continuity, not just through utilization metrics of like, the women who work for me, were engaged in this program or that program, and instead looking at it a little bit more holistically.
Kembre, I was wondering if you'd, not me awkwardly pausing on my own podcast. Sometimes I'm funny, you guys. You were just sharing so much. I was like, I'm sitting in my feelings right now. I made a promise to stop crying on this podcast. Like that was really a joke I keep making, but like every once in a while an episode gets me. And I think it does feel like so much we do in HR tends to be reactive. And like, I'm just thinking like, you were like, don't just look at those utilization rates. Cause I do feel like a lot of people are like, let's just look at utilization rates and that can determine so much. And it's like the picture is so much bigger. And we have to start thinking like, how do we proactively solve these problems? Because we did see more women leave the workforce in 2025, I think, than left during COVID. Right? It's like peak all-time highs. We're watching like rising daycare costs as well. And so it's just a time where I do fear if people wait, they're going to lose their leadership. They're going to experience that attrition. We know people are going to be unhappy. And so there is so much more proactive things we could do. But Kembre, I will hand to you.
Yeah, no, I love this around how can we really plan for something different and think about the market differently. And I don't think there's anything more apparent than what Kevin and I have seen over the last 12 months around the drive of consumerism of any sort of health condition, right? We have a lot of social media platforms to thank for visibility to different health awareness initiatives, more providers that are active on social media than ever before. And so what I would really challenge us to do in the employer space is, are we thinking about our employees like we would expect from consumer platforms? Are we really hearing their voice? It's one thing for us to know demographic data and to be able to make some good research recommendations based on clinical trials, what we know is working with other employers, what we've seen from vendors. But if we just paused for a second and said, what are my employees reacting to in the market? What are they gravitating towards? How are they utilizing care? How are they utilizing connectivity? And the reality is, I'm probably more likely today to pose a post around getting recommendations about a provider from my social media group of women that I've been connected with for the last 20 years than I am to necessarily go to a platform that says, here's the doctor rating, right? Like I want to know not only experience, but I want to know what others that are like-minded have said and felt through that experience. And I think we have to lean into employers. There's definitely more access to technology and resources. We now see more price transparency, more visibility in AI tools. I think Kevin spends an hour a day in every single tool, that's happening with AI technology. But I think as employers, we have to lean in more to the application of that from a consumer feel, unlike a very technical HR feel. It doesn't resonate. And I think we've tried for the last 20 years to make HR speak work in the health space, and it's challenging, right? Like we have to make those connections together. So if I could encourage us to just do that thing proactively, it would be leaning in to the employee voice and really hearing what women in your workspace are really needing to be able to deliver on their care.
As you were talking about how there are like more consumer facing doctors, I was just thinking, is this why I keep getting a million dermatologists on TikTok? Like, have they just discovered that I care so deeply about skincare that I'm just getting served every dermatologist out there? But you're right. It's like been a fascinating time to watch doctors like building their brands on social media and then sharing about conditions. And I like watching women bond in the comments over having like endometriosis, which Kevin was saying earlier, sometimes can take 6 to 10 years to get diagnosed, and watching women in the comments tell each other how they got diagnosed and what doctors to go to and what labs to ask for and what tests to demand. It's just been really interesting. Like there is a passion to advocate for what you want. And so I think like with that, then you should start listening to your employees too. Because if they're on social media having those conversations, potentially now take that energy too and have them bring those conversations to you. And you can think about, okay, maybe we can get a better benefits package set up together. Maybe we can talk more about these offerings that they really want because they clearly seem to care about it. But yeah, it's been wild watching. Every time I'm on social media too, I think it knows that I might be a little bit of a hypochondriac because I'll get all the videos that are like, go to the ER if this happens to you. And I'm like, stop, get me off this algorithm. Now I'm stressing about my blood pressure. Why? So just to make light of how stressed I am about healthcare, every episode this series, I've been asking the same through line question because that's the goal of the series. What's one decision organizations keep getting wrong about women's health, and what would a better decision look like?
This is a great question, and I love that you're asking us. I think we have to remember first and foremost, women's health is not a program. It is an evolution of life and work balance, right, through the process of a career. And so we need to lean in as leaders in the space, especially in HR, that get to help influence both the impact of what's available in resources, but also what influences talent acquisition and retention. And so we've got to come together. And women's health has to be a holistic strategy and an initiative. If we're starting with a program, that's a great starting place, but we can't end there. But Kevin, I'll definitely let you jump in.
100% agree, Kembre. I think I'll go back to what I said before around, moving beyond just focusing on maternity care. And just because Kembre called me out and spending at least an hour a day in the language model space with the different tools, which I do. Right now, I said in one of my favorite language model tools, I said, scrape the whole web and look at every publicly available benefit and enrollment guide and tell me the most pervasive women's health benefits. And I'll read them to you. Reproductive care, family building, fertility, maternity, postpartum. And so every single one of those items speaks to family forming benefits. There was other ones, but they were sort of at the very bottom of the page. Yeah. And again, that's anecdotal, right? But I think it's really a really good example that like when employers think about women's health, too often it's maternity care, it's family forming, but it needs to be far more comprehensive about that. And we just need to start talking about it that way, that it's a comprehensive strategy you need, not a specific solution focused on a very narrow part of a woman's life.
Yeah. I love that. Again, I would like to feel important outside of my childbearing years.
Yeah.
I would like my employer to deem me worthy of other benefits outside of just bringing life into this world, because that might not be for everyone as well. Right. So like, it's really interesting, like hearing that and then looking at the data about fertility levels declining, right? We're not giving birth to as many babies as they wanted us to. I don't know why I thought that was a good sentence to say out loud, but the fertility rates are declining. So it's interesting to think about that happening while the majority of the benefits we're giving women are for fertility. And it's like, there's a disconnect there clearly as well. So thank you both for sharing what a better decision would look like. I feel like a little weight has been lifted off my shoulder just talking to the two of you, because I think a lot of people are also thinking the things that you all are saying. And now we've armed them with so much data in this episode to go tackle what it is they're trying to solve at their orgs, or to even think more inclusively about how their employee population is experiencing the world. So thank you for spending time with me today, sharing your expertise and letting me vent about all the things that make me mad around women's health and financial well-being. I appreciate both of you. For people looking to get in touch with you, what's the best way they can reach you?
It's a great question. Email?
Usually, okay, this is actually a bit I do on outside of my Better Decisions. It's a bit I do on the I Hate It Here podcast where every single person just says LinkedIn, but I still ask the question every time just to, as a
So
bit.
I love that I said email. You can email us or LinkedIn us or social media us.
What is there an app you prefer, Kevin?
LinkedIn. Let's do that.
We're being such dorks right now. You can also email you in the show notes. All your info will be there too. But I do think it's like a fun bit to do. Kembre, best way for people to reach you. Are you on LinkedIn?
I think it would be great if you could hit me up on LinkedIn. And I'm pretty sure I'm the only Kembre that's listed on LinkedIn. But let me know if you find another.
I love there's definitely going to be somebody who finds another and then DMs you and is like, we found you.
We did it.
We did it. Well, thank you too for spending time with me today on this podcast.
Thank you, Hippo. This was a lot of fun.
This was great.
Thank you. This was great.